still remember the way the rain smelled that night. The kind of quiet drizzle that feels like the world's trying to wash itself clean. But you know some stains don't come off that easy. My phone buzzed nonstop on the dashboard, the screen lighting up again and again with messages from my sister. Please, don't ruin this day. Dad says you're overreacting. We can talk after the wedding. I didn't even read the rest. I just stared through the windshield, watching the road bore in front of me as the wipers whispered back and forth. That was the night I found out my parents had sold Grandpa's cabin. My cabin. The one he'd built with his own hands on the edge of Pinewood Lake. The place where I learned to fish, to chop wood, to listen to silence. He always said the lake had a voice. You just had to stay quiet long enough to hear it. It was the only place I ever felt like I belonged. So when I got the call from the realtor saying the property had been sold, I thought it had to be a mistake. Grandpa had promised me that place when I turned 25. He'd told me right there on the porch one summer evening, sipping his coffee, "This cabin's your heartbeat, son. Don't ever let anyone tell you it's just old wood." But now it was gone. Sold to pay for my sister's wedding. The story they told everyone was that they didn't have the budget for the kind of ceremony she wanted. The big garden venue, the designer dress, the open bar reception at Lakeside Manor. They said it was family decision. Only I wasn't part of that family meeting. I didn't even get a phone call. When I confronted Dad, he brushed it off like it was no big deal. "You weren't using it," he said. "Besides, it's just property. We can always buy another cabin someday." Another cabin? He didn't understand. It wasn't about walls and a roof. It was about the memory of Grandpa hammering those boards together in the dead of winter. It was about the smell of pine and smoke, the echoes of stories told by firelight. You can't just buy another heartbeat. I tried talking to Mom, hoping she'd see my side, but she just sighed and said, "Honey, it's your sister's big day. Don't make this about you." That sentence burned like acid. Because that's when always was in our family. My sister's big day. My sister's achievements. My sister's future. I was the quiet one. The one who didn't cause trouble. The one who understood. Maybe that's why they didn't think twice about selling the only piece of Grandpa left behind. But Grandpa had always seen me. When I was a kid, he'd take me out fishing before dawn. He'd sit there in the boat staring at the water and he'd say, "You got a quiet kind of strength, boy. Someday they'll need you, and they won't even realize it." That line stayed in my head as I parked outside the wedding venue that weekend. A sprawling garden wrapped in fairy lights and expensive laughter. Music floated through the air, clinking glasses, people congratulating each other like they'd just cured cancer. I sat in my truck for a minute, watching them all from a distance. Then I saw Dad, tuxedo pressed, champagne glass in hand, laughing with my sister's fiancé. Mom was right beside them, smiling like she'd finally won the lottery. For a moment, I almost opened the door to join them. Almost. But something inside me held back. I thought about Grandpa's cabin. About the letter I'd found in my old fishing tackle box 3 months earlier. The one I hadn't told anyone about. It had been tucked behind a loose compartment, yellowed and folded twice over. On the front, in Grandpa's handwriting, were 3 words. "For when they forget." I'd read that letter a dozen times since. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs, but every word hit like a hammer. Grandpa had known. He'd known exactly what kind of people his son and daughter-in-law were turning into. Chasing appearances, trading values for convenience. In that letter, he'd written about the cabin, about how it wasn't meant to be sold or split or traded. He said he'd made arrangements. That one day, when the time was right, Truth would return home. At the time, I didn't understand what that meant. But sitting there in my truck, watching my family laugh under a string of fairy lights paid for with Grandpa's legacy, I started to. When I finally walked in, no one expected me. The ceremony had ended. The reception was in full swing. My sister spotted me first, her face tightening just a little before she forced a smile. "You made it," she said, like she was surprised I'd dare show up. Dad clapped me on the back. "There's my boy. Grab a drink, enjoy the night. No hard feelings, right?" I nodded, but my voice was quiet. "No hard feelings, Dad. Just memories." They didn't hear the edge in my tone, or maybe they didn't care. Everyone was too busy toasting and dancing. I slipped away from the crowd, found a quiet spot near the balcony, and pulled out my phone. The lawyer's number glowed on the screen, the same lawyer who'd handled Grandpa's estate. I'd been meaning to call him for weeks, to ask if he knew anything about that letter or the arrangements Grandpa hinted at. So I called. Right there, while laughter echoed behind me and fairy lights blinked overhead. "Mr. Coleman," he said when he picked up. "You picked quite a night to reach out." "I just need to know," I told him. Did my grandfather leave anything else? Something not mentioned in the will. There was a pause. Papers shuffled on his end. Then he sighed. Funny you ask. I was instructed over something on your sister's wedding day. Actually. Said you'd call. I froze. Deliver what? A letter, he said. From your grandfather. Addressed to your parents. The sound of distant laughter blurred as my pulse started to hammer in my ears. You're kidding. No, son. He scheduled the delivery himself. Should arrive in the morning. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, thinking about the letter. What could Grandpa possibly have written that he wanted them to read on this exact day? The day they traded his legacy for a photo shoot and a party. By morning, curiosity had turned into something sharper. Not quite anger, not quite hope, but something that made my chest feel tight. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the wedding decorations were still scattered across the lawn. Ribbons, flower petals, half-deflated balloons. Mom was inside, humming softly while cleaning up the kitchen. Dad was at the table, scrolling through his phone, a cup of coffee beside him. They both looked up when I walked in. Morning. Dad said, a little too cheerful. I heard Grandpa left you a letter, I said quietly. Mom blinked. How did you? Before she could finish, there was a knock on the door. Right on cue. Dad opened it, and there stood a courier with a plain brown envelope. He handed it Oded, and left without a word. My parents exchanged a puzzled look. Dad slid it open and began to read. For a moment, everything felt still, just the faint ticking of the wall clock. His face changed with every line, color draining slowly like someone pulling a plug. Mom leaned over his shoulder, and I watched her hand tremble. Then Dad stopped reading, looked up at me. What is this supposed to mean? He stammered. I didn't answer. I just watched, my heartbeat sensing with the clock on the wall. He started reading again, voice barely above a whisper. If you're reading this on the day you sold the cabin, then you've already forgotten what it stood for. But don't worry. I made sure my real hair would remember. Mom's eyes darted to mine, wide frightened. What does that mean? She asked. But I already knew. Because Grandpa's letter, the one hidden in my tackle box, had a second page I hadn't read out loud to anyone. And what it said would change everything. Dad's hands were trembling when he finished reading. The paper in his fingers looked like it weighed 100 pounds. Mom sat down slowly, her face pale, eyes darting between him and me like she was watching something she didn't understand yet, but knew it wasn't good. I could still smell last night's cologne and perfume mixed with stale champagne. The house looked like a war zone of celebration. Empty glasses, confetti in the corners, the faint echo of laughter still hanging in the air. And now, right there in the middle of all that glitter, sat a letter that cracked everything open. Dad read the final line again, almost whispering. I made sure my real hair would remember. He looked up. What does that mean, Ethan? His voice had that half-defensive, half-guilty tone, the one people use when they already know the truth, but can't bear to say it out loud. I took a slow breath, walked closer, and said quietly, it means Grandpa didn't forget who you really are, Dad, and he didn't forget what mattered to him. You sold his soul for a wedding venue. Mom stood up so fast the chair scraped across the floor. Don't you dare talk to your father that way. But her voice cracked halfway through, and I saw something flicker behind her eyes, not anger, but fear. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my own letter, the one from the tackle box, the one Grandpa had written for me. I'd read it so many times that the folds had started to tear. I held it up without saying a word. Dad frowned. What's that? Your father's words, I said. The ones he didn't want you to see. I opened it and began to read, my voice steady but low. Ethan, if they've sold the cabin, don't be angry. Be patient. You were always the only one who listened, and listening is what reveals truth. I built that cabin with my hands, but I built something else too, hidden inside its bones. When the time comes, go to the north wall under the window. You'll find a piece of me there, something they can't buy or sell. Mom gasped. Dad's mouth opened, but no sound came out. What are you talking about? He finally said. That cabin's gone. Sold. You can't just... I cut him off. You mean the cabin you thought you sold? Because here's the thing, 3 months earlier, after finding that letter, I'd gone to check the cabin. It was locked, cold, and quiet. But when I walked around the back, I noticed something odd. The property boundary markers didn't match the official survey lines Grandpa had shown me as a kid. The old man who lived next door, Mr. Carter, told me Grandpa had changed the land deed 2 years before he passed. Said he'd tightened the corners. I didn't think much of it then. But when I checked the records later, I found it. The cabin wasn't part of the sale. The structure, yes. The land underneath it, no. The buyers had purchased the building, not the soil it stood on. Legally, they owned nothing but air and lumber. Grandpa had done it on purpose. And now as I looked at my parents, I realized they had no idea. They thought they'd sold it fair and square. But all they'd really done was humiliate themselves in front of the world for a property that didn't even belong to them. "Ethan," Mom whispered, "what are you saying?" I walked over to the window, the morning light catching the dust in the air, like floating memories. "I'm saying Grandpa knew you'd forget what mattered, and he made sure I'd remember." Dad's jaw tightened. "You can't just walk in here acting like some kind of hero. We did what we had to do. Weddings aren't cheap. Neither is dignity." I interrupted. He flinched, but I didn't stop. "You didn't just sell a cabin, Dad. You sold a promise. You sold every fishing morning, every Christmas by that fire, every story Grandpa told us about loyalty and love. You sold his legacy for one weekend of applause." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "We did it for family," she whispered. "No," I said. "You did it for appearance." The room went dead silent. Only the clock ticked between us, steady and cruel. Then Dad slammed his hand on the table. "That's enough, Ethan!" "You think you're better than us because he wrote you a letter. Because you were his favorite." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. This man I used to see as invincible, reduced now to excuses and guilt. Then I said quietly, "No, Dad. I don't think I'm better. I just think I'm not lost." He stood there frozen, breathing hard. I saw the moment he realized he couldn't argue with that. For a long time, no one spoke. Then I said, "I'm going back to the cabin." Mom blinked. "Why?" "Because there's something he left for me there. And I'm going to find it." I turned and started for the door, but Dad's voice stopped me. "You can't just walk in someone else's property." I glanced over my shoulder. "It's not someone else's, Dad, it's mine. Always was." And I walked out. The drive back to Pinewood Lake felt longer than usual. Maybe it was the weight and everything sitting in my chest, or maybe it was the way the world looked different now, colder, sharper, like the truth had scraped the paint off everything. When I reached the cabin, the sold sign still stood crooked near the gate. The new owners hadn't even moved in yet. The realtor's lockbox was still hanging on the door handle. The air smelled like rain and pine. The lake shimmered under a dull sky. I stood there for a while, just listening, trying to hear what Grandpa had once told me about. And then, faintly, I did. The quiet hum of the water. The whisper of wind through the trees. It wasn't just noise, it was memory speaking. Inside the cabin looked almost the same, dusty old, but alive in its silence. I walked straight to the north wall under the window, just like Grandpa said. The wood paneling was rough, weathered, but one board was slightly newer than the rest. I pried it loose. Behind it was a small tin box, wrapped in wax paper. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a folded letter, an old photograph of me and Grandpa at the lake, and a small brass key. The letter was short, shorter than the first one, but it made my heart stop. "If you're reading this, you found it. Good. That key opens the truth. Not everything is written on paper, Ethan. Go see Carter next door. He'll know what to do." Carter. The old man next door. I didn't waste a second. When he opened the door, his face softened. "I was wondering when you'd come, boy. Your granddad said you'd find that box someday." He led me inside. His living room smelled of cedar and tobacco, old wood and stories. He handed me a small folder from a drawer. "Your grandpa trusted me to keep this safe." Inside was another deed, one I hadn't seen before. It listed the entire property, cabin and all, with my name typed neatly under, sole beneficiary. My throat tightened. Carter nodded. "He made sure you'd never lose what he built." "The sale they made. It's void, illegal. The land was never theirs to sell." I sank into a chair, stunned. For years, I'd thought of myself as the quiet one, the one they forgot. But Grandpa hadn't forgotten me. He'd prepared me. I drove back home with the deed in my pocket, the brass key hanging from my rearview mirror. When I walked into the living room again, my parents were still sitting there, the letter between them like a ghost they couldn't escape. I put the deed on the table. Mom reached for it, but I placed my hand over hers gently. I said, "You've already taken enough." Dad's face went red. "You think you can come in here and—" "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I'm here to tell you that Grandpa forgave you, but that doesn't mean I have to." Mom broke down then. Quiet tears, the kind that come from regret, not pain. Dad didn't move. He just stared at the paper, then at me. "What now?" he asked finally. I looked at the window, at the morning light breaking through the clouds. "Now," I said softly. "Now, you remember what he built. And I remember why." And for the first time, the silence between us didn't feel empty. It felt like justice finally breathing. I thought that would be the end of it, A clean break where the truth settles into the house like dust and everyone finally learns to breathe around it. But truth doesn't just sit quietly, it ripples. And my first ripple hit before lunch, when my phone started buzzing with calls I didn't recognize, unknown numbers, then the realtor's name, then a text from my sister, all caps, all panic. I let the phone out on the counter and poured water into a glass I didn't really need, listening to the ice crack like distant thunder. Mom stood in the doorway to the kitchen and watched me like I was a stranger. She didn't come closer. "They're saying the sale is invalid," she said, voice raw. "What does that even mean, Ethan?" "It means it never should have happened," I said. She nodded too fast, wiped a tear with the back of her hand, and looked down. "I didn't know about any of this. Your grandfather, he hid things." "No," I said softly. "He guarded things." She flinched, and I regretted how sharp it sounded. But the truth was a blade we all had to take a turn holding. Dad came in a minute later, tie crooked, jaw set like he was gearing up for a battle he didn't know how to fight. He looked at me, then at Mom, and at the deed still sitting on the table, and it was like you could see him balancing pride against panic on a set of scales that never belonged to him in the first place. Before he could speak, the doorbell rang. He froze. Mom took a step back. I checked the front window and saw a tidy sedan at the curb, a man in a dark suit waiting with a leather portfolio, and that particular posture lawyers have. The kind that says everything will be official whether you're ready or not. I opened the door before Dad could. "Morning," I said. He smiled like we were old friends, though we'd only met twice. "Mr. Coleman," he said, "your grandfather asked me to deliver something today. May I come in?" Dad bristled. "We already got your letter," he snapped, halfway bluff and halfway plea. The lawyer didn't break stride. "That one was addressed to both of you. This one isn't." He looked past my father and found my eyes again. "It's for him." He stepped into the living room. The house quieted itself, even the refrigerator hum fading to a whisper. The lawyer unclipped the portfolio, took out a plain envelope sealed in red wax. The kind Grandpa liked, like it made the paper feel heavier, more serious. He cleared his throat, gaze landing on me. "Ethan," he said, and the way he spoke my name was like striking a match in the dark. "Your grandfather asked that I call you by name when I handed you this. He said you'd know why." He held out the envelope. I didn't move right away. Then I took it, the wax cool against my fingers, the imprint of Grandpa's fishing hook stamp pressed deep into the seal like a memory you can touch. Mom sat down without meaning to. The couch seemed to catch her. Dad stayed standing, stubbornly tall, but his hands betrayed him, flexing and unflexing at his sides like they were searching for a tool he didn't know how to use. I broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, with that faint smell of cedar oil Grandpa liked to rub into the cabin walls every fall. The first line was his voice so clearly it hurt. "Son, by now you've seen what people do to a promise when they think no one's watching. Open the small flap at the bottom." I looked at the letter again. There was a hidden fold, tight, almost invisible. I slid a finger under and pulled. A second sheet fell free, smaller, with a list of name dates and a single sentence underlined twice: transfer, Upawan, Raya DNG. The lawyer stepped closer. "It's a conditional transfer," he explained, though he didn't need to. "Your grandfather created a private trust for the cabin and adjoining parcels. Title passes to you upon the reading of this letter today." He glanced at my parents, careful but firm. "It supersedes any accidental or unauthorized conveyances." A mom made a small sound, something like a gasp and a prayer colliding. Dad swore under his breath. I kept reading. "I've seen you fix what other folks throw away." The letter continued. "Engines, doors, conversations. The cabin needs that kind of man. Keep it open to storms and to family, but don't let anyone board up your heart for convenience. This place is yours to protect, not to prove a point." There was more. Practical details about the trust, a line about the tax assessor, who likes lemon bars, if you feel like being neighborly, and then the part that made my throat close. "If they've traded my walls for applause, give them this: the sound of a door you didn't slam." I folded the letter. It took me a second to find words. "He transferred it today," I said quietly to the lawyer. Upon reading, nodded. With immediate effect, he placed a single-page certification on the table. "I'll record this by close of business." Dad finally moved, pacing once from window to hallway like a caged animal that didn't know where the bars were. "So it's done," he muttered. "We can't undo it. We can't." He broke off, swallowed. "Well, look foolish." The lawyer's face softened. "This isn't about appearances, Mr. Coleman. It's about a man making sure his legacy went where he believed it belonged." Dad shot me a look that could have been fury if it weren't so full of shame. "We were trying to do something good," he said, low, almost to himself. Your sister wanted. Dad? I said, and kept my voice gentle because some words only land if you wrap them in mercy. This isn't about what she wanted. It's about what you sold to get there. Silence. A minute passed, maybe two. Then the lawyer closed his portfolio, asked me to sign a receipt acknowledging delivery, and let himself out. The door clicked softly. The house exhaled. Mom dabbed her eyes with a tissue that kept folding in on itself. Your sister's at the manor, she said finally, voice thin. They're taking pictures by the lake. She wants you there. She sent messages. My phone lit up again, like it had been waiting for permission. I picked it up and read the first few texts. Please come. I didn't know. I thought it was your idea not to use the cabin anymore. Then the last one, the lawyer said there's something for you. He said he'll read it if you come. I looked at my parents. Did you tell her anything? Dad shook his head. She doesn't know. Not all of it. I weighed the letter in my pocket like it had a pulse. I'll go, I said. Lakeside Manor was exactly the kind of place you sell a promise to buy stone arches, trimmed hedges, a water feature that pretended it was a river. The sky had cleared just enough for the clouds to look expensive. Guests milled around with that post-ceremony bloom, ties loosened and heels slung casually in one hand. I saw my sister near the edge of the garden, a bouquet on the railing, eyes searching. When she saw me, she looked like she'd just found air. She hugged me first, sudden and tight, then stepped back with a fresh film of tears. You came. Yeah, I did. Sorry, she blurted. I didn't know they were selling the cabin. I mean, I knew they were talking about options, but I thought. She swallowed. I thought you didn't want it. I studied her face, the girl I'd grown up with layered under the woman in makeup and ribbon. I always wanted it, I said. But not to own. To keep. Her mouth trembled. I don't deserve that kind of brother. Maybe none of us deserves anything, I said. Maybe we just try to carry what's left. She nodded, wiped under her eyes with a quick swipe. Over her shoulder, a familiar suit approached, the lawyer again, like a shadow doing his job. He cleared his throat gently. May I gather the immediate family for a short reading? He asked, projecting just enough to be official without becoming a scene. Your grandfather provided one last note for this day. People turned, curiosity blooming along the hedgerows. Dad and Mom arrived a minute later, awkward and rigid, the kind of discomfort you can smell. My sister's new husband put an arm around her, protective and confused. A few aunts drifted nearer, and Uncle with a whiskey paused his sip. The lawyer waited for the murmurs to fall, then opened a different envelope. This one cream, not the cedar-scented stock, and addressed, to be read aloud if necessary. He looked up at me, then at the small circle of faces that had called themselves my family every holiday of my life. He began. It's a short letter, he said. Joseph Coleman wrote it 3 months before he passed. He read. If you're hearing this, it means the day turned louder than the truth. That happens. Weddings make poets of some and thieves of others. I don't write to accuse anyone. I write because love needs a backbone. A laugh snuck out of someone near the back, then died. The lawyer continued. The cabin by the lake is a house for humility, not a hotel for pride. I built it for mornings when the world is too loud, and for nights when forgiveness needs a roof. Ethan understood that without my saying. He listened to silence without calling it empty. I felt every eye swing to me and wished I could disappear into bark and water, into the simple honesty of pine sap and oars. I knew there'd die when the cabin looked more like a price tag than a promise. The letter went on. So I made arrangements to keep temptation from winning a popularity contest. If you feel angry at me for that, I'll accept it. But remember, you can't sell the sound of a loon at dawn. You can only miss it. The lawyer's voice softened for the last part. Be kind to the boy with the quiet eyes. He's holding your tomorrow. It will open for you, as often as you arrive without a performance. He folded the paper. Nobody spoke. Even the fountain forgot its job and muted itself. And in that hush, something shifted, not dramatic, not fireworks, just the tiny click of a lock inside a person's chest when they finally admit they were wrong. Dad cleared his throat and stepped forward. He looked older in that light, the daylight refusing to flatter him. He started, then stopped. He tried again. I made a stupid choice. He looked at me, and the word hovered in his mouth like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to use it anymore. Ethan, I'm sorry. Shock rippled outward, then recalibrated into relief on a few faces. My sister let out a breath she'd been strangling. Mom pressed a fist to her lips and closed her eyes. I didn't rush to fill the quiet. I let it sit between us like the lake does, deep enough to hold a boat, cold enough to wake you. Then I nodded. Thank you, I said. That matters. Later, when people trickled back to their tables and the band remembered it was supposed to play something like Joy. I walked to the edge of the property where the manicured grass stopped pretending it was nature. The lake was a glimmer through a line of trees, the real one, not the ornamental pond. Footsteps crunched softly behind me. It was my sister's husband. He fell into step beside me like he understood that silence was the right language for a minute. When he finally spoke, he kept it careful. "I'll never be your brother by blood," he said, "but if this family ever needs a door kept open without a performance, I'll try to learn how to do that." I gave him a half smile. "Good start," I said. The next ripple arrived that evening, the realtor, a buyer, then a deputy from the sheriff's office at the cabin gate, voices heated and carrying across the water. I was already there by sunset, sitting on the porch steps with Carter in the chair Grandpa used to drag outside every summer. We watched dragonclaws stitch the day closed. The deputy approached first, hat polite in his hands. "Ivanin," he said, "we've got some folks upset. They say they purchased a structure and were promised occupancy. They purchased a mistake." Carter said before I could. "Man can buy a shadow if he pays the wrong fella." I handed the deputy the recorded certification the lawyer had emailed over an hour earlier and I'd printed at Carter's. He read it, nodded once, then twice. "Look straightforward," he said. He turned to the others. "No trespass tonight. If you've got a dispute, take it to civil court. But I'll warn you, you'll lose." The buyer tried to argue. The deputy stood like granite, then walked him back to the road with a decency that didn't bend. When they left, the lake settled again, and the sky pulled on evening like a comforting sweater. Carter poured coffee from a dented thermos, handed me a cup without asking if I wanted it. "You gonna sleep here tonight?" he said. I said. "If that's all right." He snorted. "Boy, it's more than all right, it's overdue." I unrolled a sleeping bag on the floorboards just inside the door and left the door cracked so the night air could wander in without knocking. I expected rest to take forever. Instead, the cabin remembered me, and I slept like a man who finally had a place to set his head. Morning arrived with birds scribbling their signatures across the sky. I brewed coffee on the old stove, sent a text to Mom. "I'm at the cabin. Come by when you're ready." An hour later, their car pulled in. They walked up the path together, the way two people do when they don't know if they're welcome but hope they are. I didn't make them ask. I pushed the door fully open. Mom looked around like every board was an apology. Dad lingered on the threshold as if the house were measuring him. Then he crossed it. "I want to help," he said simply. "Whatever needs fixing." There were so many ways to answer that. I picked the one Grandpa would have liked. I handed him a sanding block. "North wall," I said. "Under the window needs watching. The wood goes soft there if you don't keep after it." He took it. For the first time in years, he had the right tool in his hand. We spent the morning working with no agenda but the work. Mom wiped down shelves and windows, humming an old tune she used to sing when we were kids, and her hands smelled like soap instead of perfume. Dad sanded in steady strokes, careful and quiet, and he didn't look for a shortcut. I tightened cabinet hinges that had begged for attention since last winter. Sometimes someone spoke. Mostly, we didn't. Mostly, we listened. To the grain surrendering under paper, to the distant lap of water. To the apology was happening without any one of us saying the word again. By midday, my sister texted that she and her husband were on their way. They arrived with lunch they hadn't needed to bring, nervous and earnest, and an awkward bouquet of wildflowers that looked like they'd been gathered along the shoulder of the road. She set them in a jar by the sink and laughed at herself. "I thought the cabin needed something pretty," she said, then shrugged. "But I guess it already has it." When we ate, we didn't sit at a formal table. We perched on stools and the porch rail and the cooler. The talk drifted from nails to scouts to the way Grandpa used to stack firewood like it was a language. Ends lined, faces forward, no piece wasted. At one point, Dad held up a bent nail he'd dug out of the trim. "Should I keep this?" he asked, half a joke, half a plea for instruction. I looked at the nail. Old iron, stubborn, bent from weather and time and somebody's impatience. "Yeah," I said. "We'll make a hook out of it." "For the key." He smiled, small and surprised, like Mercy had touched him on the shoulder without warning. Late afternoon found me by the water with my sister. She skipped a stone and watched it hop twice before it sank. "I could have asked for less," she said. "You asked for what you were taught to want," I said. "Now you know different." "I want to earn my way back," she said, and the sentence didn't wobble. "You don't have to perform," I answered. "Just show up without a show." She nodded, bent to pick up another stone, then decided to leave it where it belonged. As the sun slid behind the far trees, Carter ambled over with a paper bag. "Housewarming?" he announced, handing me lemon bars wrapped in wax paper. Figured you might want to start neighborly. I laughed, and the sound didn't ache. Grandpa said the assessor likes these. I told him. Everybody likes those, Carter said. Even grief. When evening came, the family drifted off in twos and quiet. Dad lingered on the porch. He turned to go, then turned back. He said, a word so small it felt like a hand extended. You think maybe I could come out once a week? Learn the right way to keep the wood from going soft. I looked at him a long time. Yeah. I said, once a week is a good start. He nodded. On the way down the steps, he stopped like a thought had grabbed him by the elbow. You know, he said without facing me. Your grandfather, he used to tell me I was always in a hurry. That I rushed past the part where things get strong. He exhaled. Guess I finally hit something I couldn't outrun. When he drove off, the cabin settled into its new old self, the boards easing the day out of their joints. I hung the brass key on the bent, nail hook we'd fashioned and stood back to look at it. Not as a trophy, not as a warning, but as a promise that I've finally found the right hand. I made a fire in the stove just because the night asked for it. The flames caught slow, then sure. I sat on the floor with my back against the north wall under the window, the place Grandpa had chosen to hide a message inside a house. Out on the lake, a loon called. The sound thin and ancient and perfect. It answered a letter line I'd read earlier like it had heard it, too. I thought about the lawyer calling my name in our living room, about a crowd of faces turning quiet together at a wedding built on a debt the lake refused to carry. I thought about the look on my father's face when a sanding block became a path instead of a punishment. I thought about the word. How it always sounded to me like air. Something you can't see but you feel the lack of when it's gone. I closed my eyes and thanked a dead man for knowing me better than I knew myself. Out on the porch, the night deepened, and the cabin held.